Good afternoon, Deborah. How are you today?
Doing great.
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for agreeing to come on and talk to me about your beautiful memoir, Whiskey Tender. I have to tell you, I absolutely loved your book. I don't know what I expected when I picked it up, but I don't think I expected it to have as much cultural significance as I found in it. So, for anybody who, maybe just to get started, for anybody who has never read it, can you just kind of give us an idea? What's it about?
So it's about, it's a coming of age
Mhm.
about a young girl who is raised for the earliest years of her life on her home reservation in southeastern California, and then is moved to Navajo territory in northwestern New Mexico for her father's job around the time she starts school. And it's about her slow awakening to the ironies of the American dream for someone from her background. So, my character is a first generation high school graduate in her family. Neither of my parents finished high school. And so they can't really lay a roadmap out about how to achieve a middle class life in this country. And neither do they kind of convey the full depth of history in terms of wrongs that have been committed against our people. And so I'm left to kind of understand and figure out and come of age with a lot of questions and a lot of confusion. And hopefully it captures some of that with humor, kind of the foibles of an American kid who is thrown into the mix in schools that aren't all people from her own culture, and kind of the stumbling blocks and the sisterhood of going through that in a family of four girls.
Excellent. That's an excellent synopsis. It really weaves together your personal memory with history and legacy in a way that I've honestly never really seen before in a memoir. Um, it's a kind of like it's almost like I received a history lesson and didn't even realize I was getting it. And I've heard you say that it started out as several essays. So can you kind of give us an idea of like what moved you towards memoir?
Yeah. So originally it was a collection of essays and it had an offer for publication as such. And then I realized that most likely it would not be read in that format. I really think that there are a lot of demands on people's attention in terms of entertainment in 2025. We can read magazines, we can read anime, we can read books online, we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime, HBO. There's so much that draws the attention of people, and you kind of think, well, how can I make my work entertaining and engaging, and how will it capture the reader's attention and have them keep turning the page? And I think that the sort of three act structure that you find in it is very novelesque. It kind of blends story, personal narrative, and this voice that the Washington Post compared to Mary Carr's voice, who we all that was a great compliment for me to receive because she's so kind of funny and she has this gallows humor, and I just love her writing. It kind of mixes it with histories that are hidden histories in this country that many people don't know about. Not all of them negative. For example, I don't know that a lot of Americans know that my grandfather's generation of Native Americans signed up to fight in World War II in such high numbers. We have a lot of veterans in Native country. And I wanted to highlight both the positives and negatives of Native contributions to this country, but I
Mhm.
didn't want it to become dry. So when my editor was editing it, after I sold it to HarperCollins, she said, this book is basically done. What do you want to do with it from here? And at that point, it really was heavily a memoir with much less history in it. And I told her I would like to amplify more of the history without digressing so far that I lose the reader because I have lost the narrative arc of the child coming of age. And she was like, okay, I'm going to help you. And so that was where you kind of get the interweaving of the personal narrative and the history. It was a really delicate balance that we kind of engaged in the final year of the process of writing the book.
And bravo to your editor too, because you definitely did achieve the balance. It it really explores impacts of a lot of there are a lot of federal policies that are just kind of tucked and hidden within that are woven within your story, like the Indian Relocation Act. Can you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about how some of these policies, including that one, um, shaped your family and your family's
Yeah,
life?
yeah, I think, I remember reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabella Wilkerson, and she kind of really taught me that there was this thing called this grand, the Black migration of people to the North and kind of out across the United States in this one era. And I thought, oh, that's so funny because that was my childhood. But from the Native perspective, most Americans don't know that 85% to 90% of Native American people were living on their home reservation in the 1950s and early 1960s. And when did that flip? Because now only a small portion, maybe 35% of Native Americans live on their home reservation. And the rest of us live in Los Angeles and Albuquerque and Minneapolis and Chicago. How did that happen that there was this huge migration? And so I kept thinking about what had happened to my family, which was when we were young, there was very high unemployment and high inflation as well in the 1970s, the early, like 1975, 1976. And my father, he was talked into going through this Indian Relocation Act or Public Law 959 via his parents, who said, someday the government will likely let us go. They will no longer fund us. They will not give money to our hospitals and our schools. And they were in dire situation as it was. My father grew up very poor, and they encouraged him to go and get trained in these schools that trained Native people to do trades. So you learn to be an HVAC or a refrigeration, heating, and cooling guy, or you learn to be a welder, as my father did, or a carpenter, or a hairdresser. And all of his siblings underwent this training. Most of them went to Los Angeles, where they stayed. Some came back to the reservation afterwards. My family, my part of the family, was the only one that went to Navajo country because my father had been trained as a welder and he found a job on the Navajo reservation. So my childhood was spent being what I call a minority Native in a Navajo majority, which is that I didn't really fit in with the local tribe. And it was kind of hard for me to know who I was because I had lost all of my relatives in this sort of diaspora that followed the Indian Relocation Act.
So, how do you feel that displacement kind of influenced your um, you took a bit of a different path from your sisters and from your mom within the book. I'm kind of trying to give a little bit of context without giving away a whole lot of the story. How do you think that sort of displacement, not really knowing quite where you fit, influenced you finding yourself and really learning about your native heritage?
Yeah, I think initially I had so much nostalgia for my relatives. My mother was she was the eldest of 15 kids, and they had the same parents. I mean, it's not like it was a step sibling sort of family. And my father was the fifth of 10 kids, and the same situation, and one of those ride or die, we don't believe in divorce sort of families. And so everyone was in the southeastern California area that we lived in, southwestern Arizona, right on the shores of the Colorado River. And so we had a lot of big parties, and everywhere we went, we would see cousins. And it was just such a community that we had. And then being yanked away to go up to Farmington it was very pressure ridden because my parents had they really enacted this model minority kind of attitude towards my sisters and I, in such that they were like, you guys are very talented, you're very intelligent, you're very athletic, and you have to excel at everything. And it was a lot of pressure. um, but I guess what you're referring to is that my sisters, they were really happy to be sort of middle class Americans who, aspired to go to Cancun for spring break, and they liked to zap hot dogs in the microwave, and they had friends from all different parts of society. And I did too, but there was just this really deep feeling that I always had from our visits home to the reservation, because we never had vacation when we did not go home to the reservation. When I would catch glimpses of tribal ceremonies, powwows, funerals, and the depth of feeling there in the ritual and the depth of history. I could just feel it in my bones. And as I got older and older, I was the one who wanted to be a vegetarian, and I was the one who cared very deeply about our traditional value system. And my sisters would tease me because they thought it was like, oh, you're the little genealogist in the family. Or when we would get together with family and I don't know, my dad would say, let's get a picture of the elders. They would push me and say, oh, go get in the picture, Didi, or one of the elders, because they could see that I had this very deep sensibility about our traditions. And I guess as I've gotten older, I've just thought, what did we exchange? Like now, a rites of passage is going to prom and renting a limo or getting a driver's license. But when
Mhm.
you look back at Native country, there was sort of the fasting vision on the mountain or in the desert, or there was the run, or there were totems, or there were like, we had our clans, like our animal clans. I come from the Badger clan at Laguna Pueblo. And the richness and the metaphor and the mythology in those rites of passage felt to me so much more epic and beautiful than what capitalist society could offer. So I think in some ways, nostalgia and leaving the reservation enriched my love of history and my desire to return to the traditions that I felt were more meaningful.
Mm, that's beautiful. I I can't remember whether I actually read it in the book or if I heard you say that America is everyone's reservation.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
Can you kind of tell me, because I think maybe what you just described is kind of a good segue into potentially the metaphor of that. What do you mean by that?
Well, for me, it's like now I'm traveling all over the country, and there are moments when you think, can I enter this place? Like it's the Cosmopolitan Club in New York City in Manhattan, and you have this moment of feeling, you know, do I belong here? And a lot of times I bend down and I touch the ground before I go in, or, I'll bring a piece of sage or cedar from home and tuck it in my pocket so I can feel it when I go in. It's a way of reminding myself that the history of this continent has the beautiful sort of myths and history and the bones of the people that I came from is in the dust, pervasive everywhere. And the erasure of that can only go so far. I think in many ways, the American spirit, like what we think of as like the courage and the athleticism that we see at the Olympics. I always think of like even that broader idea of what it means to be American as having sort of a genealogy and a bloodline that is inseparable from the great myths of native country. No other culture has mythological figures bigger than Crazy Horse and Geronimo, more epic in terms of what they were able to sacrifice to try to save their people and what they loved, other than the Greeks. The Greeks have these great mythological heroes as well. But I'm just very proud of my culture. And, I don't want it to be something that is just for me. When I wrote the book, I thought very much that all Americans, regardless of where they've come from, who feel the spirit of this country and have stood on the rivers and climbed the mountains and gone skiing or canoeing or been in the valleys, that it's part of all of us. And
Mm,
it's a beautiful history that we should reclaim and share rather than being ashamed of. Bad things have happened, but I don't want to forget the good in it, and the good is the fact
mm,
that my ancestors, they cared so much for this land and they took care of it so much better than we're currently taking care of it. And that's someone that everyone can connect to and aspire to and feel proud of if they live here in this country.
right. Yeah, we're all connected to it. And I think that in almost every way, we've kind of lost sight of that, right? Even just using nature and living as one with nature. I mean, even just something as simple as natural medicine.
Yeah, I
Is-
know. In New Mexico, we have a very sort of holistic health approach to things. So I see that here in Santa Fe, there are a lot of people that there's a return to that ethos, like farm to table. There's a desire for it. And, I sometimes tell audiences when I'm speaking that I married a man from northern Italy, and we've been married for 35 years. And when we go back to his woods to stay with his family, he lives in a regional park. He'll wake me up early in the morning and be like, "It's raining. The mushrooms are going to be out. Let's go." Or put on your boots. It's chestnut season. We're going to go collect chestnuts. He knows when to get his raspberries, his lumberjack, like all the berries and the nuts in the woods. They are so connected with their land because they've never had it interrupted. They've never been colonized. And in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, everyone comes from somewhere else, or they have been a victim of colonization. And so there's been this rupture. But if you follow anyone's lineage back far enough, you eventually run into someone in their direct line that knew exactly where they went to get their fish, or how they hunted, or what they gathered. And that sort of meaningful reciprocity with the earth, I think, is something that all of us are sort of missing in our dopamine obsessed kind of culture that we're living in. You know, we're all on our computers and our screens, and there's an epidemic of loneliness. And all you have to do is go camping for a weekend, you know, at the Land of the Lakes in your area of the country, or, you know, down to Lake Lanier in Atlanta. And, you know, you light a campfire, you hang out, you can just feel the stress leave your body. And so, you know, people have not talked about this book very much about an environmental sort of, or that the themes are environmental, but I very much see that in the spirit and the heart of the book is this complex story of the environmental relationship between Native American people and industry that is not the romanticized version of nature that is generally presented in a lot of Indigenous books.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really important point. Have you noticed, it makes me curious, have you noticed since the release of your book and in all the conversations that you've had since, um, is there any kind of, do you sense any kind of turnaround in terms of what we value as a society? Are there more people craving the ability to get back to the environment and to get back to nature?
You know, I see it especially a lot in the older generation, which surprises me because that's the generation that kind of think of as being somewhat conservative. But I've had a lot of fan mail from men in their 70s who are like, I lived through World War II and I didn't, you know, it's almost like they're saying, I liked your book despite rather than because of the topics. I didn't know that I would like it. My wife read it and I read it, and it really
Mhm.
moved me. And so I think sometimes that portion of society that remembers and can remember growing up on a farm or being in a relative rural area where they swam in the pond on the weekend and their cousins came over and they, you know, they ran around and played base around the septic tank and they went fishing with their dad and their uncles, or they hunted, you know, they're having some sort of a spark of recognition in what I'm writing about, in terms of, like, you know, thinking about how we define civilization. You know, if civilization is ultimately something that means bigger and bigger and better and better until the skies are black and we kill ourselves, that's not the best definition of civilization that you can really come up with. You know, I think civilization is being able to have empathy for each other, learning to live on the land in a way that is sustainable. I
Respect.
think that more, yeah, and you know, there's so many wars going on. There's a lot of violence right now. And so it's important that we ask ourselves, how do we want to define what it means to be American?
Yeah.
And you know, it's we're in a fraught period. So I've had a lot of interesting conversations. I have a lot of faith in Americans, crazy enough. I mean, with everything that has gone down and the difficulties that I've faced in my life, I meet a lot of good people in my travels. I really do. And when I was researching the book, that was something that I saw too. When you go back into the archives, there were always Congress people, there were always senators who were fighting for what was right. The problem is a lot of times they get shot, you know, they get shot down, they get shouted down. There's a vote in the middle of the night and they lose.
That's right.
But they're always there. There are always good people out there. And I try to expect the highest of people until they prove me wrong. You know, that's the way my dad raised me.
Well, and I think that's a good way to be. And at the end of the day, I don't think most people wake up thinking how they, how they want to ruin society or, rape the earth today. I think generally most people, we all want the same thing. Most people all want
I
the
hope
same
so.
thing.
Yeah,
It's
I hope
just
so.
it's just a matter of us kind of getting back to that place. Might take us a little while, but I'm with you. I do kind of recognize that
Yeah.
the violence that's happening right now, it seems like people have a lot less tolerance for the conversation in general. Like it's just not, war is not something that a lot of us are even willing to entertain, let alone support at this point. So I guess it's just a matter of like, what choices do we make along the way to turn the tides around so that they
Mhm.
come back in a more peaceful direction?
Yes, absolutely.
Why whiskey tender? Where'd the name come from?
Um,
I mean, to you.
yeah, I am. When I was growing up, it felt like the difficulties that my family, my dad, and his brothers, and my cousins, and everyone was enduring, it felt like it was, as a child, you don't understand history and you don't see things in context. And so it feels like there's a moral failure occurring in your family. You look at your relatives and say, well, why are we the ones that don't have decent jobs? Or why are we the ones that don't have college degrees? Or why do we have this situation with poverty? And you think that somehow, your family is not performing well enough. And then as you get older and you understand the very systemic sort of the systems that were put in place to kind of prevent your family from doing well, the Indian boarding schools, the separation of children from their parents, the funneling into dirty jobs via trade schools rather than, law school or medical school. You begin to kind of see that it's not a moral failure, it's sort of a systemic failure. And the people that you are raising you are doing the very best they can, given a Hobson's choice, kind of you get to choose between a hard place and a harder place. And you're often trying to maneuver and negotiate in a society where people don't see you as an equal. And so when I considered like writing the book and I thought what needed to be told, I kept thinking, how is this ethical to tell a story where I expose the fact that my father was tried and convicted as a teenager, for manslaughter? How do I tell the stories of poverty without embarrassing my mother? How do I go about this? And I kept thinking, well, in some ways, what I'm trying to do is subvert the stereotype or kind of like regain the pejorative. And so when you take the word whiskey and you think of what that implies in association with Native American people, which a lot of people just think kind of unable to better their own circumstances, ward of the state, alcoholic, problems with all of that. And then you combine it with the word tender, right? And in all of its definitions, because there are many ways to define the word tender, you have two words that are sort of a odd juxtaposition that when they sit next to each other, they create a question for the reader, like, what does this mean? And so I really like that. I like the idea of tender as like a tender little shoot that's just beginning to emerge from the earth, like a child who's starting to grow and it's so easy to trample. I like tender in terms of to tend to people that have problems with alcoholism. I like the word tender as a monetary exchange, which I use that towards the end of the book. And then there's tender as in like a sore muscle or wound that is tender. There were so many. And then there's tender, like emotion, like loving your family and caring for people. And I think the book, despite presenting some difficult histories, has sort of a tenderness and a love and a grace that is pervasive in the telling. A lot of people have mentioned that in reviews. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that I waited a long time to write it. I was in my 50s by the time I let it go. And I wrote it for a good 12 years. Like I kept writing it and rewriting it, because tonally I wanted it to have that love. And because ethically I had to make sure that the scope of the telling didn't serve as an indictment of my family, but served sort of as a wake up call about the systemic issues that we had faced.
Mm, that's beautiful. And it's a catchy title too. I love it.
Yeah, nobody forgets it, so that's good.
Nobody forgets it. It rings beautifully. Did you by chance pick a piece that you would like to read for us today?
I can read a piece for you today. Yes, I sure can. I will read. How long do you want me to read?
Well,
Just like,
read as much as you want. I say 200 to 300 words.
okay. So let's see. Dad always said broken bones grow back stronger, raising us the same way his older brother Gene raised him. A father's job was to control the pace of the world's wounding, to dole out the pain in slightly bigger doses over time, so that his kids would learn not to break under pressure. This is what I think of when I think of my sisters and me growing up. We didn't get anything for free, and we blossomed because of it. Blood flowering into bruises, skin thick and ripened under the Sonoran desert sun.
Mm, that's beautiful. Can I ask why you chose that piece?
I love thinking about my sisters and I when we were growing up. I mean, I think, the earliest parts of the book are, they were all written about my sisters and I as children. And just the sort of combination of determination and spunk and sort of tough girlhood, that comes through is it's the heart of the entire book for me, and when I think about why I wrote the book, I know that I wrote it for future generations, and there's sort of there's an intent for indigenous futures in it that has a lot to do with childhood. And so I think I picked that because it's the perfect paragraph to kind of show how uh, all that we have achieved in our lives, and my sisters have achieved a lot as well, has been kind of born of our grit and our determination and our sort of love of fun. So, yeah.
Beautiful. There's a theme of silence that I noticed throughout your
Mm.
entire book, particularly with your parents. And we kind of were just talking about just a minute ago how parents kind of have to choose, between hard or harder, I think was the term that you used.
Mm.
And they dealt with things dramatically differently. How how did you how did that influence you, or how were you able to navigate between the two ways that your parents communicated and dealt with pain?
Yeah, I think, you kind of, there's an evolution of thought that happens in your reaction to your parents in a situation like mine, where I guess in the beginning, I resented them as a teenager that they had never really told us very much about the wrongs that had been committed against our people. And then as I became more mature and I had my own children, I realized how difficult it is to be an indigenous parent, and to raise kids, because my father wanted us to believe that the United States was a meritocracy. If you cannot believe that hard work will serve to better your life, then you give up on working hard, you
Mhm.
know? So children who are not presented with sort of this idea of pride in where they come from culturally and where they might be able to go, they become dysfunctional. They don't find a way to be healthy contributors to society.
Yeah.
And my father, I think, knew that. And so he never wanted us, and my mother never wanted us to think of ourselves as victims.
Mm.
And because we went to Catholic school, they knew that we were not receiving any sort of that hard history, because in most schools in the 1970s and the 1980s, the lesson plan for history was pilgrims and Thanksgiving Day Indians, and it was like a friendly party. And, there's this manifest destiny march from the east to the west. And they could pretty much feed us via the schools and my parents by leaving out anything that had happened. They could give us sort of an archetypal vision of the world that is like, the police are good, the firemen are good, Santa Claus is real. It was this world that is a fictional world. And I think at a certain point as a parent, you have to kind of decide, like, when am I going to tell my child the truth about history if it's not coming in through school? Or do I allow them to eventually run into that history via a teacher who has a conscience about actually teaching what happened? And I remember being in Hawaii because my oldest daughter, married a Native Hawaiian, and my grandson was the head speaker for this Lincoln Day celebration that they do every year in Oahu. And he was practicing his lines at Christmas, and I was helping him, and I was thinking to myself, well, of course my parents didn't want to tell me, because here I am with my grandson who's 6 years old, And I don't want to tell him that Abraham Lincoln hung 38 Dakota and Lakota warriors after the Civil War without a trial, and the largest, the biggest mass execution of American citizens or American people that has ever taken place on our soil. I would not tell him that about Abraham Lincoln. He thinks Abraham Lincoln is a hero, and certainly Lincoln did a lot of heroic things, but he did create this egregious situation for Lakota and Dakota people. They weren't given a fair trial. They were hung by the people they had just got done fighting just a couple of days after Christmas or before Christmas. I don't remember. I think it was after. So you're always constantly, as an Indigenous parent, kind of thinking, when do I break my own kid's heart?
Yeah.
When do I sit them down and tell them there was this thing called the Trail of Tears, or there was the Sand Creek Massacre, or many other massacres like it, where women and children were murdered at the hands of the U.S. Cavalry? It's I think that I went from anger to appreciation for what they tried to do. And I
Mhm.
came to understand that there are no easy answers. And then there are many other more complicated reasons for the silence, I think, that would take time to describe. But in a nutshell, I think that's my family.
Mm. So how can I ask how, because you said that you're a grandmother.
Mhm.
So how did that influence how you taught this real history to your children?
With my kids, like now with my grandkids, it's my daughter's responsibility. But with my kids, when they were maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, I started reading them a lot of the Little House on the Prairie books, which have this
Mm.
mainstream perspective clearly. But then you come to these junctures where Ma feels sad and tells Pa, and they talk about seeing, for example, Native people being sent west. During the Trail of Tears. And then it was a light enough touch in the book that it enabled me to kind of introduce it and then kind of speak to it a little bit and then kind of weigh in from there. So I first started talking to them when they were in elementary school. And then we kind of grew and expanded on it. But that wasn't the most important thing I did. I think the most important thing that I did, my husband and I decided to do when they were young, was to make sure that they knew about the grand accomplishments of my Native ancestors that no one teaches about in school. So we drove them from Albuquerque all the way down into Mexico, and then we did 3 road trips through that area to see Chichen Itza, Yaxchilan, like Palenque, all of the major Mayan. I think we saw like 17 major Mayan cities, and then we took them to Peru and showed them Cusco and all of the grand Incan, palaces and everything. And we talked to them about the creation of corn, and we talked to them about the astronomy, and we talked to them about the medical practices that the tribes had. They went to Chaco Canyon, of course, which is nearby here. Um, I guess, I didn't want them to think of our culture as being absent, because that's what basically the United States did to us. They flattened us all in to this world that they call Indian, which is
Hmm.
just like a bland Neanderthal portrait, right?
Hmm.
When in fact there were so many rich botanical and medicinal discoveries. So I made sure to fill in the absent items of their education with knowledge that I had. And then when they got older, they read The People's History of the United States, and they read 1492 by Thomas C. Mann, that talks
Hmm.
about like the cultivation of crops and the size of the cities that they have discovered now via LiDAR technology. And it's hard to fight against stereotypes if there's nothing to fill it in. So you need to give them information that bolsters their sense of identity. And at the same time, we took our kids traveling around in Italy too, and they went to the Uffizi. They're very unusual kids. Like they're very comfortable at a powwow, just like they're very comfortable at some art museum in Northern Europe. So it's an interesting childhood for them, and I want them to decide what their identity is and how they want to live their lives,
Mm.
given the value systems that my husband and I share, which are really staunchly environmental.
What a motivational path. I'm sure, I mean, kind of to your point, having making the choice between teaching children the brutal, honest truth, and then the potential. What's the risk in that, right? What's the risk in just teaching them the brutal, honest truth without teaching them the beauty of
Yes.
what was actually done and what was actually accomplished? So, bravo to you for being able
I
to
mean,
be
I saw so many kids growing up that were Dene kids, Navajo kids that I went to school with, who were so angry by the time they
sure.
were in yeah, just extremely angry and unable to conceive. And I was that kid you saw at the end of the book. I'm
Mm-hmm.
very angry. There was not a perfect childhood for me. And in fact, I disidentified with the goal of academia and did not go to college until I was in my mid 30s. I traveled the world. I went to West Africa. I went to Indonesia. That's where I met my husband. Like I traveled, I lived in Europe for a while. I did a lot of crazy things because I kept thinking, I don't want to get a degree. I do not like the idea of going to a college that is an institution that doesn't care for my people and doesn't show them any respect. And then little by little, you realize the world is changing. And
Mm-hmm.
there are courses, there are Indigenous studies courses, and there are diversity and equity programs. There were, and then
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But by the time I was in my 30s, I was like, okay, now I can maybe go to university. And I did. I didn't go to get my graduate degree in creative writing from the University of Iowa in Iowa City until I was 40. I was 39 when I went up there. So I did everything backwards because I was that angry kid. I didn't want my kids to be that, those angry sort of people that can't figure out how to do good in the world. And in fact, now I have a daughter who went to Yale Law, and she's fighting for Indigenous rights and environmental issues in her law firm that she works with. And I have another daughter who's in public health and is a tenure track professor at the University of Manila, and she works in gerontology for Native Hawaiian elders. And they're all functioning well and doing well. And I think it's because if you build up a child's culture and identity, they become functional. This is the sad thing about them trying to wipe away any sort of respect for cultures that come from, diverse ethnic regions on the planet here in this country is basically what you're doing is you're fueling the fire to see more people who have criminal tendencies and are angry and are dysfunctional because they don't have a sense of self-esteem.
That's such a tremendously fair point. How many of these emotional patterns did you identify while pulling together your book, be it when you wrote the essays or when you turned it into memoir versus before or after?
So some of them you discover before, but then you're inevitably blindsided by others. Like you have cognitive dissonance about some things. And the
Sure.
best books do contain sort of a discovery for the author. So I could highlight a couple of things that I didn't know before I started writing the book, and then I kind of had my aha moment. One was the idea that, culturally, my tribe didn't believe in venerating material objects. So materialism was very frowned upon.
Mhm.
And sort of the spirit world and the world of this traditional dream that we had was the meaningful thing. So much so that when you lose people in the tribe and they die, we still to this day will dig a big pit and we burn all of their clothing and all of their belongings. And until my great grandma died, she was the oldest living person on the Yuma Indian reservation. She died in the late 80s. We would even burn their houses. So the government disallowed that and it was illegal to do, but they grandfathered her in. So when she died, we did burn her house with all of her regalia, all of her everything that she was a seamstress. She made beautiful artwork. It was all burned because we were taught that we should never grasp at material objects or like receiving things from our ancestors when they passed away. And as I was writing the book, I remembered how, as a child, my father told me that our big ceremony that was like the one big event every year that was a traditional ritual and ceremony had ended when he was a boy because every clan brought something different to the ceremony. And the clan that brought the song, the grandfather and father both died around the same time and they had not taught the songs to the next generation. And so they had a big meeting, and the older generation, the elders, including my dad's grandfather, went into a room and they talked about it. And when they came out, they said, the ceremony's over. We will never do it again because the songs are a material object in the world. And the fact that they didn't get passed down, they're gone. We can't go digging for them and seeking them because materially we're trying to preserve something that is material. The ritual itself is a material thing. And so when I kind of really realized that towards the end of the book, then I realized my book itself is against the ritualistic traditions of my ancestors. Recording this story, much like the songs not being recorded for is something that should be let go because the world is ever changing and evolving, and this is what their faith and their traditional system was. And so I'm at one hand trying to honor my culture and my traditions, but at the same time, I'm defying my culture and my traditions in order to honor it. And that to me is like symbolic of the way the river can't run uphill. Like we can't go back in time. It's impossible. And I've had a lot of people tell me, well, you wrote this book because you want Native kids to know how to resist assimilation and return to the old ways. And I'm like, no, that's not what it's about. It presents the conundrum, the spiritual dis-ease, the sort
Mhm.
of balancing act that indigenous people do in trying to figure out how can I be contemporary and yet honor my ancestors. And that's an individual path. For me, this is my choice. I know I could never be a politician. I come from a family of tribal politicians. My dad's first cousin is currently governor of Laguna Pueblo, just west of here.
Mhm.
I don't believe in politics as my path. Art is what I could do. Art is what I could affect. And that's the only thing that feels ethical to me in the world. But to tell some kid, you're unethical as a Native American person if you get a job as a computer scientist and live a peaceful life with kids. No, to
Mhm.
survive, to have joy in your existence as a Native American kid is a huge success. You were never meant to have that. I don't need you to see you marching out on the streets getting tear gassed to know that you're authentically Native American. No, I don't need you to be competing in powwows or soaring regalia to know that you're Native American. You're great at your job in computer science with your kids. The value systems that you espouse are environmental. You don't have to perform your indigeneity for anyone. You need to take care of yourself, and so that's an example of a way that I grew and I learned from this book.
How
um,
incredible. I didn't catch on to that when I was reading it at all. I'm interested to know, was there any fallout
no,
from the reservation or any of the people? Did
it's
anybody?
been it's been extremely, I think my oldest sister was a little bit taken aback by the exposure. And
Okay.
yet I will say that all of my sisters and my dad flew out to New York for the National Book Award ceremony, and they took pictures and they loved me up and they hugged me and they were really, really good to me. And they have the most on the line. I know that they do because I told stories about their lives that are difficult stories. When I was writing the book, I thought a lot about how I had to make sure to make fun of myself more than I made fun of anybody else. I had to make sure to expose my own vulnerabilities and the
Hmm.
things that had happened to me more than I did anybody else. And so certainly I could have added more things about my family, but I chose not to. And that's what you do when you're a memoirist. You cut some and leave it out because it doesn't fit what you're trying to do. And I had a very strong purpose in terms of what I wanted to portray, and that was the sacrifices that my elders made. My dad taking this job that he took as a welder at the power plant, that was not a fun job for him to have. And I judged him really harshly for it as a teenager because I thought, how can you take a job at a coal fired power plant when our ancestors told us that we shouldn't do those sort of things to the earth? And it took me a long time to realize he didn't want to do those things. It's like in Sophie's Choice, she chooses between her two kids. He
Yeah.
chose between his value system,
Hmm.
something that he didn't want to do, but he wanted to push us ahead. And
Hmm.
it's because of him that I have kids who graduated from Yale College as undergrads and went to Yale Law School and did all the one and they're doing all the wonderful work they're doing because the value system at the heart of the family stayed intact, even as it looked like my dad's actions in the world were 180 degrees, opposite of what we were supposed to be doing. And that's the way generations make sacrifices for other generations to get ahead. And so it was a hard book to write. It was
I
not an
can
easy book,
imagine.
but
And there were a lot of really vulnerable parts. The scene, the suicide scene was an incredibly vulnerable part. And the scene with your aunt and uncle when they were taken in the car accident.
yes.
I mean, just really, really candid scenes that you had in there. Were there any that you maybe like second guessed putting in there or hesitated to add? Likewise, you mentioned a minute ago that there were several purposes that you had going into writing the book.
Hmm.
What like
Yeah.
what were those? What jumps out at
Well,
you?
I mean, my Uncle Johnny and my Aunt Anita's funeral was a big concern, and it's still something that I feel like that was a really hard thing to share. And my
Mm.
cousin Tony is still alive, and she's been extraordinarily supportive of me. But it felt like it was hard to do. But the one thing that I knew going in was I could not be this sort of writer that was an apologist. Why would I be an apologist for? Like, I didn't want to have shame for the bad things that had happened. And you don't want to try to crown people with halos and say, look at how perfect we were. No, a mature narrator says, I assume responsibility for my co involvement in the troubles that I had. Here's how I messed up, not to tell a cautionary tale, but to show you what I was thinking as I made these decisions. And so I knew that rendering it honestly and showing the mistakes that I made or the things that happened that were not putting a halo on the crown, like on the head of my ancestors, was important. So, for example, one of the things is the Navajo man, Patricio Martinez, who discovered a yellow cake uranium. He was working for the railroad and he led to the discovery of the atomic bomb with his discovery. If I was trying to create something that was all about how my people had been victims or were suffered from the testing of the atomic bomb but were not involved in any way, I would have cut that out. Or I wouldn't have said, for example, that the Laguna people were scabs who crossed the picket line to work for the railroad company prior to World War II, which I don't know how to cut those things out and feel honest. I wanted to give sort of a balanced perspective on history, and so you try to go as far as you can. And the other thing about the funeral and the death of my uncle and aunt is that it was an incredibly formative experience for me as a child. It was a moment where I fell in love with our tribal traditions and my family and my people, because that's what loss does to you. It makes you love what you've lost. And I don't think, in the end, I didn't, it was a non negotiable moment. There was no way that I could leave it out of the book because it was so incredibly important to my development, my moral development as a child.
So it was a matter of how you were going to include it rather than whether
Exact,
or not you were going to. That's
excellent. That's a
something
great
that
way.
most memoirs, in fact, I would say all memoirists struggle with is that balance of being honest and truthful about the things and the relationships in our lives and still being respectful of the people around us. And you had mentioned picking on yourself more than anybody else, which is that's an obvious, plan of action when it comes to that kind of stuff. What else did you do? How else did you navigate that?
Well, I think that, if I had told it without the context of history, hidden histories, governmental policies, strategies that my ancestors employed to try to better their lives, if I had left all that out, it could have become something that read like a trauma narrative, right? Instead, it reads like this negotiation or struggle between a Native identity and an American identity as a citizen of the United States, because we're constantly balancing those two. And by the time you get older, I think you kind of have settled in on your decisions and you are who you are. But I think that most Native kids have that identity struggle sometime in their preteens and teens, where they're trying to figure out, how can I join and how can I not join, and what can I do that feels like a good career versus what can't I do. And sometimes it results in a freezing up and just refusing to get in the game. You're just sitting in the dugout and you never get off the bench, and you have sort of this stasis and you seem apathetic about life, or you have alcohol or drug abuse problems. But I wanted to portray that. And I think that with that context, it became something that um, transcended what I would call a trauma narrative, which I did not want to write. And so that's the most important thing, other than foregrounding my own problems more than anybody else's. It's incredibly important the context of why I'm telling the story of my grandfather's period of alcoholism or my father's struggle with the law.
Yeah,
If I could use it to kind of talk about the Major Crimes Act or the contribution of Native people during World War II, like I talked about, then it became something that lifted to a different level of, in terms of an intellectual offering for people.
absolutely. Can we kind of riff on that Major Crimes Act for just a second? Do you mind just
Mhm.
giving us a brief explanation of how that impacted your family?
Yeah, it was just that if you commit a crime on the reservation, it depends on the reservation, but a lot of times it's treated as a federal um, you're sent to a federal trial and you're treated much more harshly than you would be in a county or a state. And there are very complicated laws and reasons why things happen the way they do. But my reservation originally was you would be tried by local courts. And then it went to the federal government, did it for a while. And then it went to the state of California, which they did not want it. But I think there are still many tribes in the United States that no matter the crime, if you commit a crime on the reservation, the FBI is the one that's supposed to come in. And a lot of times they don't care if, especially if it's say it's a non-native person who's committing a crime against a Native American kid or girl, where rapes happen a lot in Indian country by oil field workers or people that come from outside the community, then the local jurisdiction has no power or has had no power in history to kind of go in and look. And that's why we have so many missing and murdered Indigenous women in parts of the country. So that played big in my father's life because he had a car accident um, that resulted in his friend being drowned. And he was tried as an adult when he was just a minor. And it ultimately, I think, set him on the path towards having a very disciplined life. Like my father is an incredibly disciplined man. He went back to community college at the age of 82. He takes one class a semester. After my mother died, he was like, I have to do something to stay alive and stay intellectually motivated. And so he started taking classes at a community college in Arizona. And, he took Apache history, and his last class that he took was in poetry. Next semester, he's taking algebra. So it's like, he became the man that he did because of the difficulties that he endured.
As we all do, right?
Yep.
That's how we all
Yep.
grow. I think that's how
That's
everyone.
exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
Can
Totally
we
true.
talk about your path to publishing a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah,
What do you want to know?
what, first of all, which path did you pursue? Did you just go directly after, you're with a publishing company, right? I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
can't.
I'm with HarperCollins. So
That's what I
Harper
thought.
Perennial,
I
the
thought it was
flagship.
I
Yeah.
thought it was a big one.
Mhm.
Did you
Yeah.
decide to go with HarperCollins right out the gate, or did you consider doing independent publishing or?
No, I had a literary agent. So let's see how it happened. I went to Iowa City, which is of course a MFA program that garners a lot of attention.
Mhm.
I got out, I started working on the book independently. And along the way, I decided that I was going to apply for this fellowship with a literary magazine in Brooklyn called A Public Space. And so the woman that founded this literary magazine was the first female editor of the Paris Review. And she every year selects three fellows, people who have submitted their writing to her. And she tells them, I'm going to take you under my wing and I'm going to help you develop a long essay that will be published in my magazine. And then you will come out to Brooklyn for the Brooklyn Book Festival and give a reading. And so a lot of people apply to it because Bridget Hughes, the editor, has a very good track record of discovering talent. And so she selected me and two other people, one of whom won the National Book Award for Translation a couple of years ago. It was a great, the three of us, everyone did really good. She flew us out. And at the event, the reading that she throws, because she has such a good eye for emerging talent, it gets a lot of literary agents. and editors who come and sit in the audience to hear the reading. So when you leave that reading, rather than having to query agents, they come to you and you get a bunch of emails in your inbox that are basic. And I expected this to happen, which is why I applied for the fellowship and was lucky to get it. So I found the vice president of George Borchardt discovered me at the via a public space in Bridget Hughes, and I signed with her. And then we went through a developmental phase on the book, and it got an offer first as an essay collection, and then I turned down the offer because I realized that it could be a memoir, and she agreed. I spent 2 more years fashioning it up to be a memoir. And then basically your agent says, okay, now we're going to take it out to sale. Here's the tier 1 editors that we're going to try to sell to. We'll give them 2 weeks. If nobody responds, we'll go to tier 2, which is slightly smaller presses, Algonquian or Norton, W.W. Norton. So she sends it out to, I think, maybe 15 editors in the tier 1, which is Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, Harper, different Harper editors. And within 3 or 4 days, she started emailing me and saying some of them have already read it and they want to meet with you. And so you hit maybe, I think I hit maybe like 5 or 6 editors that wanted to have meetings. We hopped online via a Zoom call, and they tell you what they love about the book, and you can ask questions about what they might want to change, and you kind of have a talk. And then that goes on, and then she starts to round them up for sort of like a bidding situation where anybody who wants to bid on the book can bid on the book. But what happened to me was there were 2 Harper editors from different Harper divisions that both wanted the book. And rather than get in a situation where they lost it, they can't bid independently because they come from the same house. They joined teams and they said, let's give her a preemptive offer before the book goes to the bidding phase. And so they preempted the book with a big offer. And my agent called and said, I think we should go for it. This is a good amount of money. So we did. And then I just had to pick between the 2 editors, and shout out to my editor that I chose, Jenny Shu, who is wonderful. She grew up in Kansas City. I lived a long time in St. Louis. And she is just wonderful, very gentle, very kind. We had a fantastic year editing it together. And she was at the National Book Award ceremony as well. And it was just, I feel like we shared in the accomplishment because she was such a great editor.
I love it. I think a good editor will go back and back and forth with you. I recently heard somebody say, I wish I could remember where I heard it, that choosing an editor really boils down to choosing who you can argue best with, because
Oh, yeah.
you're gonna get the best piece of work after you go back and forth over and over. And
They
I think
ask
that's
good
also,
questions.
yeah.
I think
What's that?
you have to find someone who asks, you know, thoughtful questions, because
Most
most
definitely.
people, yeah, with a good question, you can kind of see, oh, here's where I'm missing in my, my rhetorical sort of aim is sort of missing a step because of a question that they ask. So she was really good to work with. I can't say enough positive things about her.
Good. Well, I think having such a, it sounds like your path to publishing was paved pretty well. It wasn't as bumpy as it often is, which is a testament to your talent too, obviously.
Thank you.
People wanted
Felt
it and
lucky.
they were willing to go to bat for it, right? Let's talk about the cover
Okay.
and the texture. Can I just tell you how much I love the texture? Did you
Oh,
pick the
good.
texture?
No, I was not, I'm kind of shy about being prescriptive about things. So I was kind of easygoing about it.
So how did you choose the art? How'd that come about?
So let's see. They asked me to send covers that I liked, and I sent them. I think I liked Alexander Chee's How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which is a small little photo inset in a lot of red. And that was, and then there were a lot of memoirs have a face of you on it. And I sent them what I liked, which was his, but I sent them what I didn't like, which were the ones with the big face of the individual. And I told them,
Okay.
I don't want the photo to be my face. I don't want the photo. I'm happy with artwork and then I sent them several different photos, and then they kind of just looked at them and said, well, they put this together. And I wanted Spider Woman on it because she's a part of our mythology at Laguna Pueblo. And then it's basically my father and his brothers and one of his
Mm.
cousins in the top, and then it's my father and me and my siblings on the bottom. So there's a generational leap. And then the mountains around here and the pine cone in the back. I don't know. I didn't really, I know that a lot of authors get very opinionated about their covers. And I think if I went back, I might use like a famous piece of artwork. Like Aaron, my friend Aaron just came out with Old School Indian. It's a novel, and he used some artwork that his uncle had, and it's beautiful. And my friend Michaela MS Red Cherries, she also used a famous piece of art for the background. So with the next book, I may do that.
What advice, publishing or otherwise, would you give to aspiring authors, particularly Indigenous authors, who are just now beginning to tell their story?
Yeah, I think we didn't talk enough in my program in Iowa City about self-care. So I think it's really easy to watch someone who's writing about early expeditions in the Antarctic. You know, they kind of research, pull their work together, get chapter outlines, have an idea about where they're going. If you're writing books, that have a topic that's kind of over there, coyotes or, I don't know, there are myriad different numbers, jazz, early jazz in the Americas with some anecdotes about the musicians. That is not as wounding, and it's easier for those writers to gain objective distance on their material. When you are writing a memoir, and it's about your life, you're two people at once. You're the author sitting at the desk, as well as the kid at 17 years old, or the kid at 13 years old, or the you at 25 years old, if you're writing about your young adulthood. So you're mining this gap between who you are today and who you used to be. And, delving into those past memories can be difficult because all of us have a hard time seeing ourselves clearly.
Mhm.
And so I say be patient. Like, what is the rush? I know a lot of people who are writing books, and the attitude a lot of times that I see with my students here at the Institute is like, I have to have this done tomorrow. And I say resist the urge to finish. You only get one debut. It's your
Mm,
one shot to introduce yourself to the publishing world and the world of literature, and to say, this is who I am. This is what my talent is. This is my intellectual capability. This is the best that I could create. And so put your blinders on. Don't compare your process with anybody else's process. Lean in, write, rewrite, rewrite as many times as you can until you start to see it clearly. And yeah, I think go for the jugular. You know what I mean? You have to really go for the wounds and the things that move you and the things that you care about. A lot of times people are writing around the edge of it, but you want to go right towards what I call non-negotiable moments, like my Uncle Johnny and my Aunt Anita's funeral. The thing that you think about your identity, that it's so integral to who you are and your moral education, that if you left it out, people don't know what triggers you or makes you tick. It
yeah.
is such an important part of who you are.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes that process means just going back to the drawing board again and again and again.
Yeah,
I find that, I will come back to something that I've written and realize that it just doesn't even begin to touch the depth, or perhaps I wasn't completely honest when you can kind of step back for a while and then look at
yeah,
it through a different lens months or even years later. I'm
absolutely.
with you. I think the best memoirs are the ones that are as vulnerable as humanly possible. And that is a process. It really is. A process in and of itself to be able to uncover those things about ourselves.
Mhm.
What do you hope readers will take away from your book?
Hmm. That's a great question. I don't know that anybody's asked me that. What do I hope they'll take away? I think that art should move people. And so it's a miracle that you can write something, and perhaps after you're dead and gone, somebody can pick it up and they can cry or they can laugh out loud because of something that you said. When you write a book, you're doing the exact opposite work than you do if you create a comment on Instagram or Facebook or social media, which is an instantaneous form of communication that is sort of political. I think art instead purchases bodies outside of your temporal time. If you do it
Mm,
right, you write for posterity, you write for children that are yet to be born. Indigenous kids for me is really important thing for me to remember. And
mm,
so I think that I hope that people feel moved, I guess is what I'm saying. Like people go to journalism so they can learn from the facts. People come to memoir so that they can feel how the author was wounded by the facts.
mm.
And that to me is what matters is that people feel a visceral reaction and they can't turn away from what it feels like to grow up as a young Indigenous girl during the Reagan administration in the United States.
That's beautiful. I mentioned to you earlier, your memoir moved me in a way that no memoir has in quite some time. And I think it's just you're just incredibly talented and incredibly thoughtful about how you lay out the facts so that we can feel it. This is the kind of work that's going to go down in history books. Like this is the kind of work that I hope they're teaching in school 150 years from now.
Oh,
Honestly,
I
that's
hope so.
that's what I hope happens with this piece of work right here.
Oh, I do know that some of my own children have had a difficult time finishing it because it wounds them to read it and to see, and it'll take them some time, I think, to get through it. They're like three chapters and then they stop reading for a month or two. And then, you know what I mean? Some of them are still finishing it. And so that's what really means something to me. Or when I go out to the reservation and my aunties who are now in their 70s, they get emotional and they're crying and they hug me and they're like, your grandma Esther would be so proud of you. We really liked your book. Everything else outside of that is like, it's great and it makes me happy. And the critical praise is wonderful. But if my family had hated the book or if they found that it was, pedestrian, they didn't really think much of it, it would hurt more than anything else. I want people to be moved by it. Like I was moved when I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Or you know what I mean? You have those books that you can't forget them. You have so much empathy for the characters. And that means a lot if the character is somebody from a marginalized community
Mm.
who that group of people has not had a voice and has not had the opportunity to share with others what they experience. And memoirs in Indian country are pretty rare. So it was a bold thing to do. And I really appreciate you saying you liked it.
Not only are they rare, but the ones that are out there, I feel like there are plenty that depict the terrible stuff about living on a reservation, right? And there are also plenty that make a case for why Indigenous people should have more respect. But I have never seen one that literally brings you into the story to make you feel why and how. That I think that's what makes it incredibly rare. It's one that I'll read again. And I don't do that very often. I don't usually read books
Oh,
twice, but
yeah,
I
that
feel
makes
like
me
I spent
happy.
so much time like going and researching some kind of legislation or some kind of law that I wasn't aware of that now I have to go back so that I can kind of reabsorb the actual story. It was beautiful. It was
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Where can people find a copy?
Oh, they
Best
can
place to
get
follow you.
one. Yeah, I think Collected Works in Santa Fe, New Mexico is a wonderful little bookstore if you want to buy independent bookstore. Birch Bark Books, which is owned by Louise Erdrich and her family, is a wonderful place to buy books. Left Bank Books in St. Louis, Missouri, where I lived for many years, is another one. And the last one I'll shout out is Prairie Lights in Iowa City, which has done so much for literature through the ages with all of the wonderful authors who emerged from that MFA program. Those are the places that I would shout out.
Great. Where can we follow you and what's on the horizon for you? You
So
mentioned
you
an
can find, if you type in Deborah Taffa, you can find website, Instagram, Facebook, all of it. I am the National Endowment of the Arts gave me funding for a two-book memoir package too. So this one and the next one were written in one huge, gigantic manuscript to begin with. And then my literary agent said, let's cut it in half and keep it to just the childhood because the adulthood is very international. The 20s, my years when I leave my hometown, there's a lot of crazy travel. I liken it to like Cheryl Strayed's Wild, for people who know that, or Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love, because I'm in Indonesia on the same island she is. I'm in West Africa. I get malaria. And it really is about me trying to leave America to see America more clearly. I pulled the sort of James Baldwin, how he went to Switzerland because he thought that he was not going to manage to survive in this country. He needed some perspective. And that was way before I had read any of his work, but I intuitively knew that if I was going to survive, I would have to, go out into the world. And I think it saved my life. It made me much less precious about my own wounds to see how much of the world has suffered from imperialism and to
Yeah.
understand that the US passport is actually a very lucky and powerful tool at our disposals. We're very fortunate to have the wealth that this country has, to have the university systems that it has. It did a lot for me to see the world. And so that's what I'm working on. It's at heart, it's a love story and a continuation of Whiskey Tender that starts right where these pages end and go through about the next decade.
Any
So
idea on dates?
I'm hoping to sell it by the end of this year.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's about at 40,000 words. Yeah. So I worked on a book proposal. I'm working on a book proposal in at the same time that I'm fashioning up chapters. But in my job, I'm extremely busy from January through July because that's when all of our students come to town. And then from July through December, things quiet down.
Mhm.
So that's typically when I do the bulk of my focus and writing. And the last year and a half has been a lot of travel, like sometimes 5 appearances a month in different states. So I've been on a lot of airplanes, but it's finally starting to subside. And so I'm moving into a deep writerly phase. Thank goodness. I get very crabby when I'm not writing. So hopefully, hopefully I'll have something sold by December or maybe January at the latest.
Oh, I so look forward to it. I can't wait. Maybe we can come
Thank you.
back around and do a second conversation,
Yay.
second half. I think that would be great.
I would
Well,
love that.
Deborah, I have an enormous amount of respect for you and for your talent and for your work. And I just want to say I'm so honored that you agreed to come on and have a conversation with me. Thank you so much from the bottom of my
It's
heart.
it's been very nice. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to For Love of Memoir. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, follow, and share the show. It really helps us reach more memoir lovers like you. You can find links to today's guest, their work, and anything we mentioned in the episode right in the show notes. Until next time, keep writing your story.